Good morning. It is a pleasure for me to chair this session and especially to give the floor to George Hein, one of our former presidents in CECA and a very distinguished scholar. He's an example of how education can be fostered by people who began studying in a completely different field. So please, George, I have the hard task to keep the time. So you have 30 minutes. Thank you for beginning immediately.
Well, let's see. I have to find it first. Good. Thank you, Emma, and thank you all here, especially for inviting me to come to this conference. I know there's been a lot of work, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you about museum education. It's also a particular pleasure for me this year because it represents 30 years that I've been coming to CECA meetings. I know there are a few people in the room who have been coming even longer, but I suspect for many of you, it's long before you started your professional careers. For some of you, it may be before you were even born. So it's been a wonderful time, and I want to use the opportunity to reflect a little bit about my own sense of what's going on in education during those 30 years. This is CECA, one of the first ICOM committees. And at the founding of ICOM in 1946, there was a strong emphasis on education as an important component of museums, although at the time not acknowledged as the most important component of museums. But CECA was one of the very first committees, and we should reflect a little bit on the fact that it's not called the Committee for Education, but the Committee for Education and Cultural Action. For doing something in the world, doing something in addition to education. Otherwise, you wouldn't need that second set of part of the name. So I interpret the cultural action part as educational political action, thinking about education as a political activity, which indeed it is. And that's what I want to stress today. I remember at the '81 meeting, the first one I went to in Svendborg in Denmark, there was some talk about cultural action, but much of it, the projects were about education and some on visitor studies. Chance Scriven from the United States was always talking about education. He was one of the early people who came to CECA meetings. 10 years later, in '91, I talked about constructivism for the first time in our meeting in Israel. And in Cuenca, I talked about the sort of grid, which those of you who are familiar with my work have probably seen, about the kinds of education that we can have and the emphasis on the social constructivist form of education. But I was really emphasizing more the education part than the action part, the cultural and political action part. It took me a long time to realize that we shouldn't separate those. And in 2003 in Oaxaca, when I gave 2 lectures actually, I talked a lot about John Dewey, who has really been my guiding spirit in this. I appreciated Olga's quoting yesterday. I don't think it's fair to say that she was quoting me. I think we should say that she was quoting John Dewey as I spoke about him. And then last year, 2 years ago in Reykjavik, those of you who were there, I talked about examples of education that were democratic forms of museum education. Today I want to focus more completely on the political component of education for democracy. There are other kinds of education. We all know that all societies educate. Authoritarian societies, fascist societies, totalitarian societies, they all educate, but it's not what I'm interested in. I hope it's not what any of you are interested in. What I'm interested in is education that helps people to become members of democratic societies, gives them the tools and the opportunities to be active members of their society. Now, what does that really mean? Let me give you my argument in outline. First and most important, museums are educational institutions. Objects and material culture require interpretation. Daniel Papuga's talk yesterday emphasized education as interpretation. You can use the words, and some people do synonymously. There's no intrinsic meaning outside of a socio-cultural context. Educators are essential for developing and interpreting both exhibits and programs. I titled this talk, Why Educators? The museums need us. They are not museums without interpretation, and interpretation requires human beings, at least to develop the programs and the exhibits, if not to actually be on the spot. And education requires theories of learning and knowledge. We heard yesterday about museum education training programs that emphasize various forms of pedagogy, both theory and practice. But it also requires an end product, an aim. Why do we educate? What's the purpose? And remember, the process of education is never neutral. And the best educational theory, I argue, and not I alone, but many of you here in this room, is a sociocultural constructivism that refers to learning and knowledge theory. But in order to be progressive, it also, in democracies, it also has to have and include a political theory, an idea about what it is that we want people to be able to do and participate as a result of our educational programs. So to summarize that, the three essential components for museum educators are educational theory, practical experience, and acknowledging a social political purpose for education. And so in thinking about this, I've come to the decision, a conclusion, that we can think about the role of education in museums under three categories. Of course, these are sort of continua that in the course of, for any one museum, they might be anywhere along this horizontal line that I've written. But there is, on the left, the idea that education is just one function of a museum and not the most important one, that the most important function in museums is collection, preservation, scholarship. That view is taken mainly by art museums and also some others, and there are advocates. James Kuno is now head of the Getty Trust Museums and Research, the whole Getty Institution, argues this point, that it's not museum education that's most important, but conservation, preservation, and scholarship. Others also argue this. Or we can take the view that education is really, whether it's social constructivist or knowledge transfer, that access and education are important for a broad audience. This has been argued by many of us. Stephen Weil talked about what museums do, not what they are. What they do is educate. Or the visitor-centered museum, this notion of a paradigm shift in museums. But it's still, to my view, a limited notion of education in relation to social action. It's education alone, but it doesn't include that other piece, the social action piece. And for that, we need what I and others have called progressive education, education that's intended for social change, where the emphasis on improving the society, bringing about more social justice, is an integral part of the educational activity. And we can demonstrate this in various ways. One example, I've given this before, and it's an example I'm sure that's familiar to you, is the work of Paulo Freire, who was known in some sense, for a very museum-like educational program, because he used objects, he used dialogue, he didn't lecture to people. But the combination of the work that he did can never be separated from the purpose that he had, which was not just to improve literacy, it was a literacy program, but to improve the social condition of the people that he taught. In yesterday's papers, we actually heard about another and very similar kind of educational program. The Reggio Emilia education work that Elie Kirk talked about is indeed a constructivist, you could say that, form of education, but its foundation is a political one. It's interesting to read about, if you Google Reggio Emilia education and look at Wikipedia and look at some of the other popular statements about it, they talk a great deal about the practice, they talk a great deal about the pedagogic theory, but they don't talk about its political origins. Reggio Emilia started this program after the Second World War, led by Loris Malaguzzi, a young teacher and a politically progressive man. The area was very much a left-leaning political entity. It had a communist government in the time when the Communist Party in Italy was quite strong. And it was developed because the people in the community, the workers, the men and women, decided what kind of education they wanted for their children so they would improve their lives and have a better life for them in the future. The story goes that the men wanted, I can't remember what it is the men wanted, but it wasn't schools. The women argued that the most important thing they could do for their children was to develop early childhood education programs that will improve their lives and improve the whole community. And they had their way, and Reggio Emilia was born. But it's really important not to forget its roots and the intention, the purpose of the educational program, which I think is an important thing for us to remember for our educational programs in museums. And there are lots of ways to do that. I've talked at many other lectures about sort of content, topics related to democracy and social justice that museums can promote and are promoting. I was just in Denmark before I came here, and a whole group of mostly art museums are developing educational programs, both for schools and for the general public, programs and exhibits that they hope will improve the ability of people, the population as a whole, to participate in the Danish democratic system. The intention of the educational programs is political. But what I want to do is to sort of remind you that what we need to do is to keep a connection between education and social political action. And also I'm going to talk just a little bit about style and about our own structures in our museums. But most of this is about trying to keep that connection, and I'm going to do it historically. We did have one example yesterday of museum staff training for all staff. Remember, not only for the professional staff. There was a point of Mila Giovato's presentation, and it doesn't take too much imagination to appreciate that this is not just an educational program, but is a political educational program. It's a social action as well as education. To think that you're to determine your program so it just doesn't just cover the people at the top of the social level, but also really reaches down, in the economic sense, to those who are least privileged in your institution. I understand that, at least in the national museums in Great Britain, in UK, there are similar monitor programs that take place, and a number of them. I didn't know this before. So let me shift a little bit and talk about some historical examples. I want to go to some history. I've been doing a lot of work on the history of progressive education practices in museums. I've been trying to pull together so the sense of how this has gone through the whole history of museums, especially in the United States, where I can follow the field and know about it. And I want to talk about some examples going back in the early part of the early part of the 20th century of museum training programs. We heard yesterday about some museum training programs that clearly or indicated a social, political purpose along with the educational program. And what I see when I look at these is that people who were politically active in social issues, in progressive social issues, were the same people who developed progressive museum education programs, and the reverse, those who did not develop such programs. So I have 3 examples. The first one is the first museum staff training course in the United States was started by a woman named Sarah York Stevenson at what was then called the Pennsylvania Museum and School of Industrial Art. This course ran for a dozen years or so. I'm not quite sure when it ended. I can't find that. Included lots of practical work, also lectures. And so who was Sarah York Stevenson? A fairly ignored person in the history of museum work. I can't say it's museum education because nobody talked about museum education in those days. They talked about training museum workers. Museum education, as John Stevenson said yesterday, was certainly not a profession in the early 20th century. Sarah York Stevenson was an amazing woman. She was born in Mexico. The family moved to France when she was very young. A lot of her education was self-taught, but she achieved a very spectacular professional status. The first female professional archaeologist, first doctorate granted to a woman at the University of Pennsylvania, first woman to lecture at Harvard University in their archaeological museum. She was put on a jury to give awards for ethnology in the 1983 World's Columbian Exposition. This required an act of Congress to allow a woman to be on the jury. I haven't quite figured out why it required an act of Congress, but that's what her biographers say. She was also an active suffragette. Women did not get the right to vote in the United States till 1920, and there was very fierce activity about this, actually going back to 1850, 1849, and active in a lot of other social causes. She gave a talk at the 3rd meeting of the American Association of Museums. It was founded in 1906. In 1908, it happened to meet in Philadelphia, and therefore she happened to come and give a talk. She was really not active in AAM. She was an anthropologist, not a museum person herself, although she was responsible for the archaeological museum. She was essentially a curator. Also, she went on field trips. She gave this talk. She described her program and talked about how they had students, and the students who were already enrolled in the university could get it for free, and other students could also enroll, and this is what it consisted of. And she ends, the last paragraph of her talk says, she wants to train people in its various branches and aspects, the museum's various branches and aspects, with the object in viewing, establishing a basis for the training of curators and of opening a career to men and women of liberal education. There were very few careers open to women in the United States in 1908. They could become teachers, and they could become librarians. Those were the only professions that they really were allowed to be in. This is a total aside, there had been a movement for women to become doctors, but the American Medical Association basically kicked them out. So the medicine was no longer a career open to women. It's a very strong political statement which she makes at this AAM meeting, and the delegates were very interested, and they all voted, and they said, yes, yes, we really have to discuss this, and in the next year we'll have a round table about programs for men and women to join the profession. It didn't happen. The next year, the president of the AAM, a man named Lucas at the time, who argued that you shouldn't have training programs because curators were born and not made, that it took a special natural quality of getting along with people and having social graces and so on that made you a curator. And they got somebody to give a little talk about education, what they did in the museums for new staff. And it's all about men of quality who will become curators. So it's a political movement that failed, you can say, but it was clearly political. The next example I want to give is of two different museum programs in the United States. One is, which is very famous and well known in the United States, was the Harvard Museum Course. Harvard University decided to have a museum training course, and they hired Paul Sachs. Paul Sachs was a graduate of Harvard, but not a professional museum person, not a professional anything, in the sense that he didn't have a professional degree, but he was one of the children in what his father, Paul Sachs's father, married Mr. Goldman's daughter to create Goldman Sachs, the banking firm, which of course still exists and is very much in the news. And Paul Sachs was supposed to take over the firm. At some point, he stayed there for about 10 years, and he couldn't stand it. He really wanted to collect. He was a collector. He was interested in art. So one of his friends from Harvard said, why don't you come to Harvard and work with me at the Fogg Museum? And so he started the course. And it was a wonderful course, and it taught a great deal. Students met at his house. They included trips to museums, and you take them to private collections up and down the East Coast. He even made the students spend $50 a year starting their own collections, very much pushing them. And $50 was not a trivial amount in those days. It was, at the beginning of this course, a third of the tuition at the expense of private American universities, and by the end of it, it was about a quarter of the tuition. And he didn't emphasize education. In fact, Paul Sachs was very instrumental in the founding of MoMA. He recommended Alfred Barr as the first director. Was a young student from his course that that MoMA should hire him. And he gave a speech at the founding of MoMA where he said, the museum of the future should be a comprehensive and enduring community of scholars pursuing the functions of study, teaching, and research. And as Andrew McClellan, who quotes his speech and then describes it, and not pander to the uninformed public. So this idea, this is very much also political, but I would hardly say an example of sort of democratic politics. In contrast is the museum training course that was established at the Newark Museum. The Newark Museum is well known as a social, progressive museum, and it was directed by Louise Conley. Louise Conley was an amazing woman, very much like Mrs. Stevenson. It was a 12-month practical course, had 5-week rotations in every department, the library, the exhibits, the administration, docentry, that is education. They also did visits to museums and so on, but it was very practical. And in fact, they paid they felt they were coming there for 10 months, young college graduates. They needed a salary. So they paid them what was essentially half a salary, a $50 a month stipend. And there's a picture on the left of Connolly and one of the apprentices teaching, picture on the right. They also used the apprentices to staff some of the first-person exhibits that they showed handicrafts in the Newark Museum. And they did all sorts of work there. Newark was very progressive. John Cotton Dana was the person who was the director. But much more important politically, I think, is Louise Conley. I won't go into too much about her, but I'll just make one point, which is the top thing I've written here. She wrote about this program in its first incarnations. She died, unfortunately, in 1927, just 2 years after the program started. But she writes, we had a museum whose activities multitudinous to be manned or womaned by limited in numbers yet specialized in training, by people limited in them. I must have left out a word. I've looked into this, and as far as I can tell, the recognition of the sexism of language and the efforts to make a language less male-dominated stems from, at the earliest, the late 30s and most likely in the 40s. There are very few examples. The people who write about this, about the history of changing the way we use language, I've never seen a reference to anything as early as 1927, which pointed out that to say manned, the museums are manned in English, is of course a sexist way of writing it. But Louise Connolly was there, as she has, and there's a number of other things she's done. I won't go into them in such detail, but always associated the political intentions with her educational ones. And this notion that museums can have politically, socially democratic origins comes up in a variety of forms. I've been talking now mostly about art museums, but if we look at the origins of science centers, we find that they again have a social origin, a social intention in their start. At least in the United States, we think that science centers were originated by the first one being the Exploratorium in San Francisco. And of course, Frank Oppenheimer was the founding director and its director for many years. Among his best friends and co-workers in this project were Philip Morrison and his wife, Phyllis Singer. Frank, by the way, and his wife, Jackie Oppenheimer, were both very much involved in this. Both, as you may recall, if you know your history, very much involved in leftist causes and activities. Frank was blacklisted in the United States for a number of years because he had been a member of the Communist Party. And David Hawkins, a philosopher and historian, all these people had worked on the atomic bomb. And after the war, a number of American scientists, I assume scientists in other countries as well, argued that since they had both worked so hard and so successfully at something that was destructive, they should turn their work, their efforts, to something that was more constructive and that would help society. And a number of them got involved in science education, so ultimately leading to science museums. The person who's written about this most clearly actually is another scientist, a colleague of theirs, Gerald Zacharias, who started science education programs because he felt that if you want people to be decent in this world, they have to have some kind of intellectual training that involves, and this was his mantra, observation, evidence, the basis for belief, why we do things, think about them. He has another lecture that he gave, which is worth quoting. It was largely a matter of social conscience, I believe, that motivated us scientists to do schoolwork. He did only schoolwork. Oppenheimer and Hawkins and Morrison did museum work. As scientists, he goes on, we believe in proof, we believe in having some evidence for what we do, and he says very optimistically, a Hitler or a McCarthy, that's Joseph McCarthy in the United States, could not survive in a society which demands evidence which can be subjected to examination, to re-examination, to doubt, to question, to cross-examination. I only wish that politicians today would also adhere to these criteria, or that voters today would have the skills and the enthusiasm for evidence that these men and women were trying to establish in museum communities as well as in education, formal education in their time. 5 minutes? Perfect. I have two more things that I want to say. Now, I think I can do it in 5 minutes. It's not just the political purpose that we should think about. It's also the style in which we treat our colleagues and the way we work among ourselves. Actually, some of this comes to me because I was involved in some of these educational efforts, and what was impressive to me working with these scientist-organized groups was not just their political goals, actually I didn't understand them as well when I was in them as I do now, but also the nature of the organizations. They were basically flat organizations without a lot of hierarchical structure. And one of the rules, one of the social rules is that you treated each other decently. It also is a quality which I realize, as I've been doing more and more reading about John Dewey, was very much associated with him. If you read what people say about him, Lucy Sprague Mitchell was a student of Dewey's. She started the Bank Street College, which is a well-known progressive higher education institution in the United States. She said, he was a wonderful listener, completely lacking in self-consciousness. In later years, she asserted that Dewey's greatest contribution was to stimulate others to think for themselves. Each of us had our own John Dewey. I love that. Formed by what John Dewey made each of us think. And another woman who worked very close, she was a generation younger but knew him well. Her family and the Dewey family were friends. Said he was a very relaxed and permissive kind of person. He was a giant, an intellectual giant, yet he was an easy person to get along with. So there wasn't this sort of distance, and I think that an important quality we should think about in our own institutions is to try to make them, as much as possible, friendly places. Which brings me to the last point, which is if we want to establish educational programs that are democratic in spirit and democratic in content, maybe we have to think about the hierarchical structures of our own institutions. As James says, there's an alternative model to the typical Western approach of very hierarchical institutions. And this has been shown. Jette Standal in the Women's Museum in Aarhus established such a program. And to end with quoting of former, very active CECA member, Elaine Gurian, who I'm sure many of you know, she talks about the Children's Museum in Boston, which was a pioneer in developing new museum education practices and also socially conscious programs. She says, we were the equivalent of a commune. We were at a time in America when collective action had a brand new and politically viable currency. This is in the 1960s and 70s, where the structure of the single leader and the followers was going on all around us. We were all politically left-wing, as was Michael Spock, and we had a deeply held belief in the value of individuals and the value of inclusion, and we worked desperately hard to make that happen. She also points out they argued a great deal, they disagreed about a lot of things, but this was a goal that they all had. So what I urge you all is work both within your institutions and in your programs outside your institutions to always keep in mind that the most important value is trying to develop socially responsible programs and exhibitions that support and promote democratic practice. Thank you.